This is the Anbernic CUBEXX. Many consider this to be the best portable device to play Pico 8 on right now, which is 2025. And let me get this out of the way, I agree. And in this video, I will tell you why. Hi, I'm Christian and I care about Pico 8. And if this was my first emulation handheld and I was looking for something, with a Pico 8 focus, the CUBEXX would be an easy recommend. But also, this is not my first handheld. I have a whole drawer full of them. So I've been around the block for a while now, and in this video I want to take advantage of that. I want to take a deep dive into the current state of Pico 8 support on emulation handhelds. If you haven't been paying attention, you might be pleasantly surprised. So for example, I want to take a look at all of the firmware options that are available for emulation handhelds like this one, like the CUBEXX, to help you choose the right one for you. And finally, I want to compare the CUBEXX to all the devices I reviewed previously, like the RGB30 here. But first things first. If you're new to this channel, you might be wondering, what even is Pico 8? Well, it's kind of a retro engine that can be used to make these kind of like cute retro indie games. I have a whole bunch of videos on my channel on how to do that. It's been around for years now, and there's like a huge library of games available for the system. And one of the things that makes it interesting for an emulation handheld like this is that you can browse this gigantic library of games from within the device. Part of Pico 8 is kind of like an app store which you can use to browse all of the games online. You can download them, play them immediately. That's a huge deal. Except it's not really an app store because those games are all for free. You have to pay for Pico 8, but afterwards you're good to go. It's a big deal, not just for Pico 8 sickos like me, but in general it makes those devices a lot more fun and a lot more useful. Now I should add that most handhelds also offer free Pico 8 emulators. A famous one is called Fake08. Those are great in a pinch or if you just want to test the waters. But what we are interested in here is running the real Pico 8 on the device. That gives you access to the Explorer game browser I have mentioned before, and you will not run into any compatibility issues. And that is what we mean when we say native Pico 8 support. Alright, so we will be looking at this thing, and it's called the CUBEXX, and I'm mentioning it so many times now because there is a bit of an issue here. Anbernic also offers another handheld called the CUBE, without the XX. That's not the one you want for Pico 8. It's easy to confuse the two because they look almost the same. In fact, the CUBEXX is kind of a scaled back budget version of the original Cube. It runs for about $50. It features a more modest chipset and supports only Linux instead of Android. But that's perfect for our purposes. It comes in black, white, and beige. I ordered the white one. It comes in a perfectly unremarkable box with only a generic USB cable and a bit of a phoned-in instruction pamphlet. What we have here is a horizontal handheld that is noticeably bigger than a GBA, for example, but a little bit smaller than a 3DS XL. And it is also noticeably lighter than the 3DS. The company Anbernic has been in the business for a while now. They're pretty much the biggest and most prolific manufacturer of those cheap Chinese emulation handhelds, and it kind of shows here. The hardware feels way more premium than its price tag would suggest. The plastic has a nice satin feel to it. On some places you have those intricate microscopic textures like here on the shoulder buttons or on the back, and that reminds me a little bit of the PlayStation 5 controller actually. Despite it being called the Cube, Anbernic went for a very curvy design. There are no hard edges here anywhere. On the back there are those prominent, protruding ergonomic love handles, and those give you a super good grip. I am German, and of course we have a special word for it. Handschmeichler. It literally means hand flatterer. It refers to polished, round, smooth objects that are just super nice to hold in your hand. Objects that feel like they have been made to fit perfectly in your palm. Wait a minute. Let me check the English translation real quick. Worry stone? The Germans are supposed to be the grumpy ones, huh? That is completely not what I mean at all. I mean that the device is nice to hold, positive emotions. But there is also a little bit of a downside here. Because of those handles, the CUBEXX ends up a little bit thicker than it has to be. You can tell how thin it is in the middle here and how far the handles bulge out. And the difference will become more striking when we get to the comparisons. For now, let us continue with the buttons. we have our common face buttons. Unlike the case material, they have this very nice glossy finish. They are non-clicky membrane buttons that feel on the stiffer side with a very tangible trigger point. They have tons of travel too. The D-pad is a Sega-style circular D-pad, which I know will be a system seller alone for a lot of people. I personally prefer the traditional Nintendo Cross, but I can also see why people like this design. If you want to hit those diagonals, this is certainly the way to go. The D-pad also features the rubber membrane switches with similar firmness and tangible pressure point as the face buttons. The plastic for the D-pad is a little bit more matte, which I think helps with the grippiness. One oddity is that I can't really feel a central rocker here. I can press in the entire D-pad without it wanting to tilt in any particular direction. I might be overthinking this. It seems a bit odd to me, but it might be down to just my inexperience with this style. Because in practice I had no real complaints, it works perfectly well. Yes, it does trigger diagonals more easily, but I guess that's the whole point, right? I will say that in some games, in a few isolated instances, I failed to trigger the up direction when I wanted to. But again, this might be just a familiarity issue. Certainly not even close to something I would consider a deal breaker. This is a solid D-pad, and I know that many people will love it. Moving on, we do have two analog sticks that look and feel like Nintendo Switch sticks. I don't really care that much about analog sticks on those devices, but this is one thing that actually distinguishes the CUBEXX from the Cube. They moved the left analog stick down, and I like this. It makes the device look more symmetrical, and it also makes the D-pad feel like a more intended way to play. The analog sticks also have a neat party trick, which you've maybe already seen. We get to it when we turn it on. Moving on, we also have a nice and tactile clicky start and select button. I like that they are together. I have games where I need to press start and select together, so it's great for that. I wish they were on the left side because sometimes I also need to press, some face buttons at the same time, but I'm not gonna cry about this. I'm strong. I'm powerful. I'm thriving. And the thing is, the place on the left side is actually taken up by my favorite button, the menu button. Yay! Many emulation handhelds have these, but quite often they end up being minuscule, not nice to press at all, and not that useful. Not this little perky guy. Look how rounded and happy it is. It's chunky, it's clicky. You are going to be happy pressing that little fella, and he will reward you for it. More on that later. Now let's look at the top side, and let me tell you about my least favorite button, the power button right here. It sucks. It's freakishly small and recessed, and as we will see, you actually need to long press that sucker to turn on the device. Ugh. This button alone is probably my biggest grievance with the device. I hate it. Next to it, we have a perfectly normal volume rocker, same layout as the Switch, and works flawlessly. Very nice. Then we get a single USB-C port for charging and everything, the cloaca of the handheld world. Then we have a reset button that is hard to press, but in this case it kinda makes sense. Unlike the power button. And then finally we have a mini HDMI port for video out capabilities, and we are going to test those for sure. Now there are two sets of shoulder buttons with a nice texture I've mentioned before. The bumper and the trigger both have membrane switches with a lot of travel. It's not like, analog trigger level of travel, but I'm probably not going to be using those a lot, but if I have to, I will be happy. Moving on to the bottom, we have those two slots, but I think they are just for the speakers. We also have a super valuable 3.5mm jack. Elsewhere, you might be paying something like $90 for this. You also get not one, but two SD card slots, and if this is your first rodeo, the left one is for the operating system and the right one is usually for the games. And then on the back we have a small splattering of various logos which, well, not to get ahead of anything, but if the RGB30 taught me anything, it's that these symbols is what makes my brain think that the people who made the device know what they're doing. It just feels super sketchy when that's not there. Well done, Anbernic. You printed the symbols of competence. So, overall, nothing really out of place. Aside from minor quirks, everything is familiar and expected. There are some delightful details and a reassuring level of polish. To me, this looks and feels about twice as expensive as it actually is. This feels like good value. So I want to turn this on and walk you through the firmware question, but before we do, I think we need to discuss the reason why we are talking about this handheld in the context of Pico 8. Yes, this has a square screen. Pico 8 games are also square. Duh. Seems like a no-brainer why it would be such a good match for Pico 8. And it is, But it's a little bit more complicated than that. I already talked about this in the RGB30 video, and everything I said there applies to this as well, because I'm pretty sure this is the same panel, which is not bad at all. Yes, the screen is square, but whether it is a good fit for Pico 8 depends on not just the aspect ratio, but also on the actual resolution. This is a 720 x 720 pixel screen. A Pico 8 image is 128 x 128 pixels, and that doesn't divide neatly into 720. So, in order to display Pico 8 content on the screen, you have two ways to go. You can scale it up by a non-integer number and accept that you will just lose some of the crispiness of the pixels. Or you can go for a clean 5x integer scale with a small black border around the image. Luckily for us, either way is fine actually. As with the RGB30, the image looks gorgeous either way. It scales fine to full screen thanks to Zep's magic Pico 8 upscaling routines. But if you want that extra crispiness, and I generally do, the image is still nice and large when you go pixel perfect. It's a gorgeous, vibrant screen, simply amazing. Now, as I also mentioned in the RGB30 review, the screen also turns out to be a surprisingly good match for a lot of other systems if you want to do emulation. Game Boy and Game Boy Color are a given, they are also almost square after all. And surprisingly, the NES and SNES also run at an almost square resolution, at least internally. And if you crop out just a few pixels on either sides, you can get a large, crisp, integer scaled image. This is the integer overscale trick that also worked very well on the RGB30. And even a widescreen system like the Game Boy Advance is still a good match because its 240 pixel wide image divides perfectly into the 720 pixel wide screen. And sure, you end up having some letterboxing, but also the resulting image is still larger than the original Game Boy Advance screen. Surprisingly, you can get a gorgeous large image for any major retro system with this screen. But you might need to do some configurations. Which brings me to the topic of custom firmwares. So I think custom firmwares is actually the reason why those emulation handhelds blew up in the first place. These used to be these throwaway cheap portable devices that came from China that came with these super wonky pre-installed software. But then teams of resourceful open source developers jumped in and worked hard to create software to expand the capabilities of those systems. And they turned them into those, emulation Swiss Army knives that they are today. The way this worked until now is that whenever you got one of these, you immediately deleted the pre-installed software and you immediately installed the one custom firmware that emerged for a given device. But with the CUBEXX, this changes a little bit now. So now we have at least 3 open source firmware projects that are all viable. And in addition, the pre-installed software is also slowly getting better and better. So I wanted to walk you through those 4 choices as a bit of a guide to help you which one to choose. I'm going to show you the stock firmware as well as MinUI, MuOS, and Knulli. And you might be surprised to hear that all of them feature native Pico 8. Yes, this has been a major development in the last year. Firmware teams are now way more informed about what a good Pico 8 integration looks like. It's a huge W that this has been embraced so thoroughly. Well done, everybody. But then, because times are changing, I want to raise the bar a little bit further. In the past, I've been always a bit critical how long it takes to set up those systems. So this time around, I want to show you and compare how the different firmware options look like without any additional configuration, with minimal tinkering. It is 2025, and I think we can expect even open source teams to step up their game when it comes to user experience. Before we jump into firmwares, I want to discuss 2 features that all of the firmwares have in common. All of the firmwares support HDMI out through the mini HDMI port. So yes, you can plug in your CUBEXX to the TV and you can maybe attach a wireless controller and suddenly you have this nice emulation console. Now, if you want to play Pico 8 like that, things get a little bit dicey because for some firmwares this doesn't result in a great experience, and I will mention it when that comes up. But something you can do is to use the USB-C port to plug in a keyboard and a mouse and use the CUBEXX as a tiny little Pico 8 laptop. Yes, this is cute, and it's actually amazing that it actually works for every single firmware that we're going to discuss. But also, let's be real, it's not actually practical. Those firmwares aren't really set up to be development environments, but it is funny that it's possible.
Stock firmware.
Okay, so here I am booting up the stock firmware that the CUBEXX ships with. And as you can see, it requires a long press on a tiny recessed power button. And as you can also see, I'm going to rewind a little bit, the green power LED lights with quite some delay. This is going to be a complaint with pretty much every firmware on this list. The power button on this thing is a source of major frustration. I already despise any long press in general, but the crappy button and that delayed LED response makes this the worst possible experience. I never know if a device is already on, if I need to keep pressing, it takes ages. Sometimes I press so long it turns off again. Plainly, this just sucks. Don't get me wrong, this also sucked before on other devices, but this is a whole new low that we reached right now. I am one of the olds. I remember when you were able to turn on your Game Boy with a juicy, satisfying, clear flip switch. Delightful, immediate response, no ambiguity. This was like what, 30 years ago? Anbernic, I know you can do hardware. I know you can turn the ship around. That part of the experience is trash and it needs to go. I am calm. I am grounded. I'm thriving. Alright, after a pretty short boot time of around 20 seconds, we are on this screen and we also see the device's party trick. Yes, the analog sticks have RGB LEDs. Woo! I usually dislike gadgets like this, but I must say, especially on the white device, I kinda dig this look. I'm getting rainbow unicorn. Now don't worry, in the menu you can easily change the color or even turn it off, but for me, this stays. Otherwise, the menu experience is not bad at all. You get these large vertical columns in a fairly neutral design. There's a super loud clicking sound when you navigate the menu, but luckily you can turn this off. So yes, you might be surprised, but even this stock firmware has native Pico 8 support. The caveat is that it is not the version that my device shipped with. Pico 8 support has been introduced in December 2024. So in my case, if I want to enjoy Pico 8 on the stock firmware, I had to go through the extra step of updating it. Which is a bit of a bummer because the fact that it's pre-installed is one of the major advantages of the stock firmware. If you need to reflash your SD card, then you might just as well pivot to a custom firmware. However, once the firmware is installed, getting Pico 8 to run is as easy as extracting a Lexloffle zip file into this prepared folder on the SD card. And there you go, Pico 8 will now show up as one of the systems in this Game Room menu. It will run in an upscaled full screen by default. If you want to run it in integer scale, you would need to deep dive into the actual configuration files. There's no way to set that from the menu. Also, there is no built-in option to launch directly into Explorer. To do that, you need to set up an MTP8 file and put it into the ROM folder. Not a big deal, but just an additional step you need to know about. Now, a couple of notes to be aware of. Volume buttons do work when you are in Pico 8, but you get no visible feedback for it. The shortcut combination to quit out the OS also doesn't work in Pico 8. So you always need to find the shutdown option in the actual Pico 8 menus. You also can't put the device to sleep from here. You can only shut it down completely. This is a bit annoying, but also sadly not uncommon. Native Pico 8 is kind of like an exception to the other emulators on the device, and some features might not work properly. Another common nitpick is that the action buttons are swapped. Usually when you play Pico 8 with a controller, this right A button will be the cross button and the B button will be circle. Here it's the other way around. Again, annoying but oddly common. I have no idea what's happening here. This is potentially fixable by editing some config files, but you know, who has the time for this? Also, while the HDMI out works for other emulators, Pico 8 boots up all stretched out and there is no sound. So yeah, that's trash. But honestly, none of these are deal breakers and you can have a perfectly fine Pico 8 experience almost out of the box. What a time to be alive. Now, things take a turn for the worse if you ever want to do anything else than Pico 8 on it. For some reason, the device has two separate emulator collections in the menu. The aforementioned Game Room seems to host some sort of built-in emulators, and let's not mince words, they are hot garbage. Completely unusable. Quick note from me editing this video, you've probably already noticed this weird rainbow shimmer. That's the camera's fault. I need to work a little bit on my recording setup. That's not something you can see in real life. What you can see is the horrible melty smoothing filter in this emulator. All of them are set up with that atrocious melty smoothing filter. They all have horrible abominations of bezel overlays. Like, what is even this Game Boy one here? I love how the Super Nintendo one somehow looks like a PS1, but most importantly, the games actually run bad. They stutter and run poorly. I want you to appreciate the sound delay in Super Mario Bros. Yikes! Now, to be fair, the game room emulators have one redeeming feature. If you hit that menu button I was talking about before, you get a nice OS native menu that features pretty much all of the things that you want to be tweaking when playing a game. So from here you can exit to the OS, or you can save and load save states. You can also switch between different image scaling presets. I really like that kind of menu because to do all of those things otherwise would require you to memorize a whole bunch of, button shortcuts. I wished more OSs would go down this route, and today we're going to see at least one OS that does this even better. Now, since you can manipulate image scaling, you can almost salvage some of the emulators, but some of them are just going to be lost. I want to show you this because this is kind of like a good example of what I mean with badly configured emulator. A good test on a Super Nintendo is Mega Man X. When you start the game, you have an energy bar on the left side, and that is made up of single pixel parallel lines. On an emulator with a well-configured image scaling, these lines will be regular and clearly separated, like in this example. Now, the Game Room emulator, on the other hand, offers a few options, but no matter what you choose, it will never look right. The lines will be irregular and blob together. Ew. So yes, all of this is trash, but I think it's also the reason why there's this other option called RA Game. Here you get the same systems, but they all run through the RetroArch backend. And this is a whole different story. The games on here run way better, and the scaling options are configured reasonably well. Nice and clean bars in Mega Man, no weird sound delay in Super Mario Bros. The Game Boy and Game Boy Advance have this weird LCD grid filter, and we still get some of those bezel overlays, and I'm not a big fan of either of those, but at least they are not as much of an eyesore as in the Game Room. And just to be clear, all of this can be customized to look exactly the way you want, but I just wanted to show you what you get out of the box. The downside is that the RetroArch emulators don't have that cool OS menu. Instead, when you press the menu button, you are dropped into the RetroArch menu. And hoo boy!
Hello darkness, my old friend. I've come to...
If you're like me and you have a restraining order and are legally barred from getting close to the RetroArch menu after that last incident, you can also play the game of Remember the Shortcut to do basic things. Yay! If you think that's not bad, I'm gonna ask you again, after you took a break from playing the device for a month or so, see how it feels to confuse load game state and save game state. But that's also pretty much par for those emulation devices, and also that's pretty much all you get in a stock OS. You can configure some settings here and there, change the color of the LEDs, set up your Wi-Fi and so forth. Things you won't find here are options to configure, for example, the shutdown or boot up behavior, so the device will always boot into this OS menu, and tapping the power button will always give you like this fake sleep, basically it just turns off the screen and still drains the battery. A long press on the power button will shut the device down for good, and I do appreciate the goodbye message, getting a bit of a clear feedback of what's going on. I did a small endurance test, and on the stock OS I got around 5.5 hours of Pico 8 gameplay. Here you can also see how the little green power LED turns red as a warning. That happened surprisingly late, just about 10 minutes before the device shut down for good. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was the stock OS.
Knulli.
Alright, this took quite some time, but I wanted us to have a good baseline to compare the custom firmwares to. And the first one I want to talk about is called Knulli. Actually, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. I guess it would be Knulli, but I'm German, so I'm gonna call it Knulli. My gut feeling is that Knulli is not the most popular firmware for this device, but it's pretty good and it has quite some pedigree. It is a fork of the popular Batocera Linux distribution. After a tiny bit of a longer boot time of around 20 seconds, you get into the front end. This is Emulation Station, and it should be familiar to you if you've seen my reviews of the RGB30 or the Game Force. But let us not get ahead of ourselves. We need to acknowledge two things. First of all, the analog sticks LEDs have changed color. They have been changed to green to match the branding of the OS. That's nice. And also, there is music. Honestly, this is a bit of a wild choice and quite unexpected because everything else here seems pretty tame and safe. First of all, yes, this also features native Pico 8 and the installation procedure is similar to the stock OS. You just need to extract the Raspberry Pi Pico 8 file into a certain folder. Now, something I'm impressed with is this very comprehensive and very well organized documentation website. It has a separate section just about Pico 8. It explains very thoroughly and clearly what you need to do. It's even localized to different languages. Wow! And this is what launching Pico 8 looks like on Knulli. And I must say, I'm impressed. By default, it runs in stretch to full screen, but if you dare to rummage around in the admittedly convoluted menu, you will find a setting to run it in pixel perfect as well. And look at this! This time the buttons are mapped correctly. And this time you can even exit out to the operating system by pressing menu and start at the same time. It even allows you to trigger sleep mode with Pico 8 running. And Pico 8 even looks nice if you plug in an HDMI cable. Clearly, quite some care and effort went into making sure that Pico 8 is well integrated into the system. Delightful. And I'm happy to report that the same care and effort went into setting up the emulators as well. Pretty much every emulator I tested is set up properly. Not necessarily how I would set it up, but in a way I would agree should be the default. None of the systems have corny borders. The scaling is great. Mega Man on the SNES has a nice and crisp energy bar. You can tell that they decided to stretch the image to 4:3, which is not the internal aspect ratio of the SNES, but it is what you would see on a TV screen. And the NES gets a similar treatment. I particularly appreciate the way they set up the Game Boy, giving it this tasteful and appropriate green tint. Wonderful. All of those systems look great out of the box. I haven't found anything that needs fixing. This should be the gold standard. It's crazy that it's not. Now, one point where this firmware could be a little bit better is the menu, the in-game menu, or more precisely, the lack thereof. Pretty much everything you want to do is delegated to Shortcut Land. Exiting the OS, managing save states, everything. You can't even enter the RetroArch menu without remembering a shortcut. And in case you were wondering, yes, of course all of these different OSs have different shortcuts. Well, almost. Quitting to the OS is quite often menu and start. But again, good luck remembering how save states work on this OS after a long break. One important feature we haven't seen in the stock OS is the ability to customize boot up behavior. So for example, you can turn on this quick resume mode, and this means that when you shut down the device during a game, next time it will directly boot into that game. If you turn on automatic save states, you can basically just immediately continue playing where you left off. I know, right? Like a real gaming device in 2025. And this even works in Pico 8. Well, almost. Obviously, native Pico 8 doesn't feature save states, but if you shut down Knulli while playing Pico 8, Knulli will boot into Pico 8 and launch that game on startup. My only complaint here is that it's not standard behavior. Why wouldn't you want the device to operate this way? Come on, Knulli Devs, you already made that bold choice with the music. Take a stance. Stand up for user experience. Anyway, shutting down the device is a little bit less customizable, but also better than the stock OS. Knulli also has a bit of a shallow sleep behavior when you tap the power button, and you can also shut down properly by doing the long press. Now, one thing I seriously appreciate here is how the device buzzes the rumble motor when it actually shuts down. That goes such a long way to clarify what's going on. Okay, finally, do you want to hear something crazy? I did another endurance test in Knulli and I almost got a whopping 8 hours of continuous Pico 8 playtime. That's nuts. This is the best OS in this test by far. And I can't really tell why. Perhaps it has to do with Knulli's extensive power saving options? And check out how not only the power LED but also the analog sticks turn red as the battery runs out. And that starts an hour before the device actually shuts down. Cool and impressive. And that's all I have about Knulli.
MinUI.
Alright, let's look at something from the left field. This third firmware is called MinUI, and it's a good example of what happens when a developer takes a bold stance. MinUI is what it says. It's supposed to be an OS reduced to just the essentials. As little as possible standing between you and playing the games. As expected, the boot time is a breezy 16 seconds here. MinUI boots into a clean black and white interface reminiscent of the analog pocket. No frills and whistles, no distractions, no settings to speak of, just games. And of course, the RGBs on the analog sticks are off. You don't even get a power LED when you're in the game. And I gotta say, I kinda dig it. What I don't love is the installation procedure. MinUI on the CUBEXX installs itself over the stock firmware. So depending on where you're coming from, you need to install that first. first. And then MinUI is being an odd duck by actually installing itself on the second SD card for some reason. So now you're juggling two OSs, putting files on two different SD cards, naming folders in specific ways, parsing this dense txt file that contains wildly disparate instructions for all of the supported systems. For an OS that is supposed to be, simple and minimal, this is miserably complicated. And then you aren't even done. You see, I'm kind of lying here. MinUI on the CUBEXX doesn't actually support native Pico 8 out of the box. There is support for Pico 8 on other devices, but not on the CUBEXX. But you can make it work. You just need to dig up some custom scripts on GitHub, and also you need to go through that installation procedure. But then you're still not finished because MinUI is so minimal, it doesn't even have Wi-Fi. So then you need to get a Wi-Fi script working as well. And then the one supplied in the GitHub repo didn't work, so I had to look for another one, and that didn't work either. So I ended up writing my own with support from ChatGPT, which I'm sure doesn't blow up in my face. Look, I'm gonna cut to the chase here. I had a miserable experience getting this to work. Maybe I got extra unlucky. I think some of my SD cards died on me while I was doing this. Who knows? The bottom line is that you can make it work, and this is what it looks like. In the default configuration, Pico 8 boots into an upscaled full-screen mode like we've seen before. I was already in the weeds manipulating config files, so I just set it to pixel perfect because I thought it suited the OS. You'll see in a moment why. The games all show up in the main menu, but if you want to launch Splore, you need to exit out to the Tools menu and run Splore from there. Just an odd wrinkle here, but that's also where you turn on the Wi-Fi, so it kind of makes sense. The menu button doesn't work like in other emulators on the MinUI, which is a shame, and again, you will see in a second why. However, you can exit out of Pico 8 to the main menu by tapping the power button. That's a feature of this custom GitHub script. And like in so many firmwares, the action buttons are swapped here as well. If you attach an HDMI cable, you get a solid picture, but for some reason you get no sound. Overall, a little bit better than the stock OS, but also not exceptional. Kind of what I would expect from support that was hacked in. Alright, let me show you the emulators and the reason why I was so interested in the MinUI in the first place. So first of all of the emulators are impeccably configured. Pretty much every emulator is set up pixel perfect if possible. SNES and NES are all using the integer overscale trick, so Mega Man's power bar has laser sharp pixels and the image fills out almost the entire screen. Somehow this is even better than Knulli. This is somebody going through every single system, knowing exactly what they're doing and making sure it runs perfectly on this device. This is worth a lot. But that's not all. So I am in an emulator and check out what happens when I hit that menu button. Bam! Custom menu with downright heavenly user experience. I can save states, I can load them, I even get small screenshots reminding me where I saved. And look, if I hold the menu button, it reminds me. That's how I can adjust the screen brightness. Sweet! Here inside the options you even get a bit of a minimalistic setup where you can still tweak the emulator, but it's only reduced to the most useful and reasonable features. No more remembering shortcuts, no swampy RetroArch menu, just well thought out UX. And look, if you prefer shortcuts, here, you can configure your own. Bam! And it doesn't end there. If I tap the power button, the device goes into shallow sleep mode. It stays like this for a few minutes and then powers down for good. So if you end up forgetting about it, it won't drain your battery. But also doing a long press in a game makes it do an autosave before it powers down. It even displays a nice message. And then, you guessed it, that's what it will boot into the next time it powers up. This is default behavior. No need to configure anything because that's reasonable. So yes, it is a pain to get it to work. But when it works, MinUI is a beacon of what these devices could be. It shows you what happens when a firmware is created with a vision, with user experience in mind. Now, if only that vision extended to the installation process and the way Pico 8 is integrated, heaven could be in place on Earth. Now, there are still a few caveats here. There's a small uncommon issue that I found that I was able to capture here on camera. Sometimes when I wanted to shut down the device, it would show me the goodbye message, but then suddenly cancel out of that and return me to the main menu for no apparent reason. Not sure what happens here, just added to the pile of frustrations with that power button. But let's wrap up by talking about the battery life, because this is one part where I had a seriously rude awakening. MinUI for some reason gave me only 2 hours and 40 minutes of Pico 8 playtime before my test card mysteriously froze and the device crashed. I did this test with multiple SD cards and it kept happening over and over again exactly at that point. I don't think the firmware is draining the battery faster, I think this is some kind of glitch. It didn't happen in casual playtest because when I do that I usually cycle between different games. It's certainly a huge bummer to see that kind of major glitch, and it certainly casts a huge shadow over choosing this particular firmware.
MuOS.
So let us move on to the last firmware, but certainly not the least. MuOS is quite often cited as the best OS for this device, and it's easy to see why. After a breezy boot up time of just 18 seconds, you get into the main menu. This is perhaps a good time to add that you might notice a disparity between the boot times I list and what you see in the video. Not quite sure where that comes from, maybe the SD card had a bad day. Regardless, MuOS does boot quite fast. MuOS is short for Mustard OS, and you can probably guess what color everything is themed in. The menu is nice and slim, you still get a good level of customizability like in Knulli, but not that kind of heavy Byzantine menu system. I think it's a good balance. And yes, native Pico 8 is supported out of the box. Like with Knulli, you get a super sleek documentation with detailed installation instructions. There's also an extra step that you need to do on the device where you need to actually assign a core to your Pico 8 files. Thankfully, that's something that you only have to do once for your entire directory. Something I do like is how at this step you get to choose whether you want to run Pico 8 in pixel perfect or upscaled. That's very nice. The face buttons are configured correctly too. Now the regular shortcut to quit out to the main menu doesn't work. For some reason, in Pico 8, that shortcut is different here. You need to press Start and Select instead of Menu and Start. Boy, I do love remembering extra shortcuts so much. But on the other hand, you can still put the device to sleep while in Pico 8 by pressing the power button. Overall, a very solid integration, almost as good as Knulli's. Unfortunately, I can't say the same about the configuration of the emulators. Take Game Boy here. The image is stretched to fill the screen, disregarding the slightly non-square aspect ratio of the Game Boy. You can tell how the sprites are vertically elongated, but the elephant in the room here is of course that we somehow have a shitty bezel on top of the game, and the corners have this weird vignette effect. Who made this? What were they thinking? This is a mess. To be fair, Mega Man on the SNES looks fine, and so does Mario on the NES. But then the Game Boy Advance has this weird gigantic chin over bezel and this vignette effect again. This is worse than the RetroArch configuration of the stock OS. This requires work to get to a usable state. But on the flip side, I have to say I do love how you can configure exactly what happens to the device when it's put to sleep. This one also does this cool thing where the device can shut itself down after it has been put to sleep for a while. And you can even set the timer. It is a bit weird to me that it looks like there is no long press, short press differentiation between sleep and shutdown. The power button just always does the one thing, and by default this will be sleep. If you want to shut down for good, you need to either do it from the main menu or you need to rely on the device doing it itself. Or you can change the power button behavior to be shutdown. Another thing that you can configure on MuOS is this thing that we talked about. It can do a save state on shutdown, and you can set it so it boots into that game and loads the save state automatically, so you can continue playing where you left off. But you need to hunt around in the menu for it, and I think it should be on by default. I do like how you can configure the device to rumble to indicate different states when you press the power button. That helps to make that power button a little bit less ambiguous, at least when shutting down. Alright, here are 3 more things that ended rubbing me a little bit the wrong way when I was testing MuOS. I don't like how the charging works. On all of the firmwares, when you plug in the device, it kind of boots up into this charging mode. It's weird and I don't like it. I prefer my devices to charge quietly. But MuOS takes the cake by leaving on the analog sticks all the time while charging. That's not what you want when you plug it in on the nightstand. I also don't like how the power LED is off by default. It doesn't even turn on when the battery gets low. What's the deal here? Yes, I can turn it on in the menu, but why do I have to? The last complaint I have is that the HDMI port doesn't support hot plugging. So you need to shut down the device and boot it up with the HDMI cable attached. That's weird and not well documented. I thought the HDMI wasn't working at all until I figured it out. And none of the other firmwares require this, even the stripped down MinUI doesn't require that. Well, the silver lining here is that at least Pico 8 looks good through HDMI. And when it comes down to battery life, MuOS does not disappoint. I got a solid 7 hours and 20 minutes, that's almost as good as Knulli. Weirdly, the analog sticks turned red with a whole 3 hours remaining. That's a little bit conservative, don't you think? And there you have it. 4 different firmwares, all with different strengths and weaknesses. In summary, I was impressed by how usable the stock firmware was. Native Pico 8 support even here is very welcome, although having to do a system update means that you can just as well install custom firmware. Knulli feels very refined and with probably the best Pico 8 integration, although all of the OSs don't differ that much. What I found more impressive were the very well configured emulators. But I have to say, the menu system does feel a bit heavy and outdated. MinUI was a pain to get working, but once it did, the vision was intoxicating. The emulators are impeccably configured, and that custom emulator menu is a true game changer and something I wish other firmwares would also seek to adapt. Sadly, Pico 8 support feels hacked, and all the technical issues make this a tough firmware to wholeheartedly recommend. MuOS looked like a clear winner to me at first. It's slim enough, but still offers plenty of configuration options. Pico 8 support is great, but where it falters is at the stock emulator configurations. Those are hit and miss at best. If you add weird quirks like the stick LEDs being on while charging or the HDMI output requiring extra steps, all of that makes me think that this needs a little bit more time in the oven. Perhaps the next version will nail it. So, which one is the winner for me? I have to say, that is a little bit hard to say. I'm honestly struggling to pick a clear winner here. Let me put it this way. If I had to do like an official recommendation, I would probably just pick Knulli. It's not what I expected going in, but in hindsight, it just looks like the safest choice. That is just a rock solid firmware. But the one that I'm actually going to keep on my device is probably going to be MinUI. There's such a huge gap in usability between MinUI and the other firmwares that makes me actually want to maybe forget about the glitches and deal with them somehow. I don't know. But the good news is that whichever firmware you pick, you will probably end up with a very good Pico 8 handheld. Perhaps even the very best Pico 8 handheld. But how can we tell for sure? Well, we need to compare. The closest competitor is obviously the old Powkiddy RGB30, the previous best Pico 8 handheld. And the truth here is that the difference between the two is rather small. They are both similar in size and they both feature the same screen. The CUBEXX certainly wins on build quality. It's a device that just feels a lot more refined. But something that struck me when I picked up the old RGB30 was that I do appreciate the form factor. The squareness of it makes it feel a bit more firm and compact. It feels a bit thinner and more portable, and that's also worth something. Now, one of the complaints I had with the RGB30 is that it had some battery issues. I sometimes ran into some weird glitches. I did not experience anything like this with the CUBEXX, and I know for a lot of people that will be just the deciding factor. But it's not like the CUBEXX is without any problems itself. I mentioned how I don't like the power button and the usability of it, and that's something that will bother me every time when I pick up the device. But the thing is, we aren't going to ever get much differentiation on the hardware side. In fact, that is kind of like where we are with the handheld market right now. Anbernic and all of the other companies are making basically the same device over and over again, with basically just aesthetics differentiating them all. I think the thing that will truly make or break the next great Pico 8 handheld is going to be the software and the resulting overall usability. That is one of the reasons why I was so excited about MinUI. It felt like the biggest step forward since like OnionOS. Yeah, OnionOS on a Mio Mini, remember that one? Which, quick aside, also now has full native Pico 8 support. I have to apologize, I forgot to make a video about this, but yeah, they ironed out all of the kinks and it works flawlessly now. So yeah, that's also on the table now, and it's still fantastic. Easily one of the best firmwares I've seen for any of those devices. But hey, if MinUI is the future, then the RGB30 can also do that. You can install MinUI on the RGB30 and it even supports native Pico 8 without weird hacks. So yes, I would say that the CUBEXX is currently technically the best Pico 8 handheld if you are in a market to get a device that runs Pico 8 very, very well. Get the CUBEXX. I think you will be very happy with it. But if you already own an RGB30 or a Mio Mini Plus or something like this, the difference is probably not worth getting a whole new device. It's probably a better idea to explore all the firmware options that popped up in the meantime, or maybe just upgrade your current firmware. You might be pleasantly surprised. But finally, the real discovery, the thing that blew my mind doing all this research, is what a big deal Pico 8 has become in this space. People are catching on, firmware devs are getting the message. Emulation handhelds and Pico 8 go together like peanut butter and jelly. I'm hungry. Let's get out of here. Yes. If you're new to this, I need you to know that this channel is being supported by generous donations from my generous supporters on Ko-fi. If you want to join them, the address is ko-fi.com/lazydevs. I would like to thank to everybody who makes those videos possible. Thank you so much for your support, guys. If you want to see more hardware reviews like this, I have more of those up on the channel. I have a review of the RGB30 that might interest you, or of the dev term. I have another video coming up of the U console, but that's something that we're going to discuss later on. And if all this talk about Pico 8 made you curious, then hoo boy, do I have a set of videos for you, my friend. So check out the channel. That's all for today. See you next time around, guys. Bye bye.